Hello and welcome to Fantasy View, a podcast about reviews for fantasy novels. I'm Jason Hubbard. Now, I'm sure you've heard of Pride and Prejudice, right? It's a romance novel by Jane Austen that takes place in England sometime in the early 1800s. I actually picked this up in my school library back in high school, or maybe it was middle school, mostly because I was intrigued by the name. I thought that maybe the story would somehow give me some keen insight into the human psyche concerning, well, Pride and Prejudice. What can I say? I was stupid. I had at least read the first chapter, and then I said to myself, nope, not for me! And then I put the book back on the shelf. A teacher, sounding a little disappointed, asked me why I gave it up. I said something like, it just seems to be about people looking for someone to marry. What I should have said is, I quickly found it to be a terminally boring period piece about young ladies pursuing gentlemen, and little else in the world of stuffy aristocrats where people are concerned about not causing a scandal at parties by accidentally sneezing on the host's houseplant or something. My life is ruined! I mean, not every story I read is about a ragtag band of unlikely heroes who strive to defeat some big bad. They do make up the lion's share, though. But to pique my interest, a story has to have characters who are pursuing interesting things as a hobby, or maybe as part of some important mission. A story about people pursuing romance, and that alone, just like Pride and Prejudice, is just not enough. Many years later, I was in a Barnes & Noble when I came across Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. I remembered reading a newspaper review about it, so I instantly recognized it for what it was. It's basically the classic romance novel Pride and Prejudice. Only with zombies. You know, The Walking Dead. If you happen to hear something just now, don't worry, that's just Jane Austen rolling in her grave. You see, some guy named Seth Grahame-Smith took the classic novel, which is in the public domain, and changed some words and added some segments so that the story now not just happens in pre-Victorian era England. It now happens in pre-Victorian era England, which happens to be on the verge of the zombie apocalypse. For example, the original novel opens with this line: "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." But in the zombie version, the line has been changed to this: "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a zombie in possession of brains must be in want of more brains." And then it goes on to say that one Mr. Bennet, rather than desiring to marry each of his 5 daughters to men of means, instead has them trained in the killing arts from the Far East. Just reading this much convinced me to buy this title. The original story may have left a bad taste in my mouth back in my youth, but this new version just seemed too funny and fresh to pass up. Now this seems like just another piece of fan fiction, which is a dime a dozen on the web, but it's actually from publisher Quirk Classics, which specializes in classic novels that have been altered to have them appeal to young readers. It's an idea that started with editor Jason Recolak, who then passed it to Seth Grahame-Smith, who then made the manuscript. And that's all there is to that. Smith is an author who likes to mix 2 genres together that aren't usually mixed. For example, look no further than his most famous work, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. I haven't read this title nor seen the movie, because I can be fickle about what I spend my entertainment dollars on, and things like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter is a pretty good reason for that. But from what I've read in reviews, the story pretty much plays the premise straight. The story is of a man who hunts vampires, and later becomes the 16th US president. It may seem bizarre to see this important historical figure running and leaping everywhere and driving stakes through vampires' hearts, and then be elected president later on, and that may be the whole point of the story. But the story never winks to readers/viewers, indicating that, yes, the creators know full well that this is a silly concept. Many people actually appreciate this, while others find the concept just too bizarre to be entertained by. In similar fashion, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies pretty much plays the premise straight, being a mix of historical fiction and zombie horror. One odd thing about it is that the inclusion of zombies doesn't necessarily turn this into a story about people's survival during the apocalypse. I mean, how can it when wealthy aristocrats still throw fancy balls and pay social calls? There are characters who are concerned about their social statuses and the numbers in their bank accounts, in addition to worrying about how to safely traverse the countryside without becoming a midnight meal for the undead. The main character, Elizabeth Bennet, and her sisters are ass-kicking masters of martial arts. Yet the story is mostly about them looking for future husbands. Elizabeth and her sister Jane do the same thing they do in the original. They go to a ball held by some neighbors with the sole intention of finding men who interest them. Jane talks with a man named Mr. Bingley, while Liz talks and dances with Bingley's friend, Mr. Darcy. Darcy is a very proud man whose choice of conversation topics turn Liz off, so Liz feels that the night was wasted in talking to a man who holds no interest with her. And then zombies invade the mansion's stores and kill some people. And the chapter ends saying that even though the zombie attack was most unfortunate, the party was mostly considered a success. As I've implied earlier, I am not a fan of the original novel. So when I saw Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, I had assumed it was going to be a kind of biting satire of the original. I thought it was going to poke fun at the fact that people are so concerned about social graces, while the undead wandered the cities and countryside. But as I approached the middle of the book, I realized something. Despite the differences that Smith made, Jane Austen's original text makes up the majority of the book. And it's still the old, dry narrative that had turned me off all those years ago. Seriously, I find the classic narrative style of 19th century books to be pretty tedious. It's full of unnecessary words that are put in there purely for the sake of sounding polite and hoity-toity. Sure, Smith added some segments that I found pretty amusing, such as one scene where Liz thwarts a zombie attack and burns the mound of bodies, showing off her sweet moves to a very impressed Mr. Darcy. But such segments are far and few in between. Once an amusing segment is over, the book turns back to Austen's dry narrative, and I get stuck reading about the complications of Liz's love life and the crises her family undergoes concerning wealth and marriage. In other words, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is still Pride and Prejudice. Don't let the name nor the cover illustration fool you. Reading this book is like seeing a movie adaptation of the original novel, but every now and then you switch channels to The Walking Dead on AMC. The change in tone is as abrupt in the example I just gave you as it is in Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. If you're like me, who can only get through Pride and Prejudice with the help of clothespins, you probably shouldn't bother with this quirk classic. As the publisher's name implies, the book is quirky, but it's not a laugh-out-loud riot, and it's certainly not a biting satire. Ironically, if you are a fan of the original and you have a sense of humor, then this book might be for you. That's the impression I get from reading some of the reviews on Amazon. Fans of the original appreciate rereading their favorite classic with a quirky, dark edge added to it. Hell, one reviewer even suggests that the altered setting actually fixes some of the weaknesses of the original book. Why would Liz ever accept the borderline intolerable Mr. Darcy? Because of the discipline she gained from her training in the martial arts, of course. I like to think that this book was a missed opportunity. Maybe it could hold some appeal to non-fans of the original if the author had written the entire thing himself instead of just making slight alterations to the original text. The original is in the public domain, so one can just rewrite the plot with all or most of the characters and make it more zombie-focused and adventurous. One can still have scenes about balls and social calls while having dialogue that reflects the horror of living in a zombie-infested world. Perhaps Liz can save Darcy's life a few times, only to learn that that doesn't win his heart for whatever reason. Rewriting the story in this way would be tricky, but if done right, it could be brilliant, even more so than how it is in its current state. Before I go, I should say I realize that this book can just barely be called a fantasy title. But there was a lot I had to say about it, so I couldn't resist doing so. And besides, zombies are technically a thing of fantasy. No matter what science fiction may say, The Walking Dead are things that cannot and will not ever come to pass. Just like learning that your deceased mother and father were actually wizards, and so that qualifies you to attend a school of magic that the world at large has never heard of. But keep dreaming, dear listeners. It may happen to you someday. I'm Jason Hubbard. Thanks for listening to Fantasy View, And please, keep reading.